second here. It seems like everything wants to go wrong on us at the same time. All right, but yeah, we are officially live now streaming on YouTube. So what I'm going to do really quick, just to wrap up our announcements for the day before I introduce our distinguished speaker, is I am going to quickly just give an announcement related to the Rbg Centennial Conference. So what I'll do here, family, is I will share my screen. Got a lot going on over here. I'm in the middle of working very hard with the organizing, but also preparing a lecture for next week. So yeah, I'm very busy at the moment. But what you see here on my screen, family, is so the Rbg Centennial Conference. We told you all a lot about it over the past month or so. The website is officially up. It's www.rbgcentennial.com. And we'll drop a link for everyone in the chat. But if you go here, the dates for the conference are August the 8th and the 9th. So that's a Saturday and a Sunday. The theme is Garveyism and the Renewed Cry for African Nationhood. It's a 2-day conference. You can read all about it on the website. But just at a very high level, day one of the conference is going to be a look back at the past 100 years. So in that examination of the past 100 years, one of the things that we want to do is take a look at some of the movements that have given political and cultural form to us as a people. So we'll be looking at, the movement to free our political prisoners, the movement for reparations. Of course, we'll be looking at like the Garvey movement. But on day one, we have some very unique panels. We have a panel, Education for Self-Determination. We have a panel that is Free 'em All. It's a talk with our political prisoners. So we'll have Mama Janine Africa from the Move 9 will be on that panel. Baba Daruba bin Wahad and also Baba Sekou Odenga will be panelists on that panel during day one. We'll have Queen Mother Mashariki Jawanza, who is the female national co-chair of NCOBRA. Will be giving a talk on the reparations movement. So that's all on day one. It's a jam-packed schedule. We have more than 50 speakers signed up for our breakout sessions. So we have 5 breakout sessions that'll be done over a 2-day period. On day two, again, we have a great panel starting off the day. It's addressing police terrorism at home and abroad, and that panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Tyreen Wright. But we have some great panelists on that panel. Other panels that we have as a tribute to Amy Jacques Garvey. She used to run a column in the UNIA in the Negro world, and the name of that column was Our Women and What They Think. So we have some very hard-hitting sisters who are going to be doing a panel that's speaking on strategies for healing the nation. So that's on day two. And then we finish off day two with an all-star panel dealing with strategies for feeding and protecting the nation. I'll be moderating that panel, but we have Philip Smith, who's the president of NAGA. We have Brother Amari from the HTNT group. Brother Kalanji out of Atlanta runs the FTP movement. Brother Balagoon Ojatede, he founded African Martial Arts. Vernon Zeke Jackson, aka Attorney Awesome, he's the founder of Building Powerful Minds. And the closeout speaker for that day will be Baba Walimo Baruti. So you can, again, go to the website. It's www.rbgcentennial.com to learn more about the event. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. So that being said, I want to catch my breath here. And I am going to introduce our speaker. So our guest speaker today is Dr. Errol Henderson. And I was fortunate enough to hear this elder, this brother, this warrior speak. This was back in January. He was on Time for an Awakening with Brother Rich and Brother Elliot. And I was just really blown away by the dialogue that they were having related to his new book. So I reached out to Brother Elliot and Brother Rich to see if we could get his contact information. And it just so happens that serendipitously, Dr. Henderson had reached out to me on Twitter because I had left a comment about how excited I was after listening to his interview. And he saw that comment and We connected on Twitter, and today he is here to speak with us all. So, before I bring him on, I just want to read you his bio so that you know who's presenting today. So, Dr. Errol Henderson is an associate professor who teaches intellectual international relations. He earned a PhD in political science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He has authored more than 40 scholarly publications, including 5 books. The latest on the Black liberation struggle of the 1960s and 70s. The revolution will not be theorized. It was done by SUNY and is available free online through the TOME Initiative. And another role of religion and international relations, scripture shrines, scapegoats, and world politics 2020. And that was done by the University of Michigan Press and also free online through the Tome Initiative. He's presently working on 2 manuscripts, one on the role of white racism in international relations, and two on gender and the urban peace and justice movement of the 1980s and 90s in the US. Since 2002, he has been the faculty advisor to Penn State University's Black Caucus and has been outspoken and challenging white supremacism in academia. Being Black at Penn State is an article that he wrote in the student newspaper about white supremacism in academia. His recent book, The Revolution Will Not Be Theorized, examines Black cultural revolution in the U.S. with a particular focus on the Black Power movement. The roots of this phenomenon are in the transformations of slave religion in the context of slave hiring, which motivated the leadership of slave revolts, e.g., Gabriel and Denmark Vesey's and Nat Turner's revolts, culminating in Black participation in the U.S. Civil War, which W.E.B. Du Bois characterized as the largest and most successful slave revolt. And prominent Civil War historians such as McPherson, Kahn, and McCurry today characterized as a revolution, a slave revolution. It draws on, develops, and integrates analysis of Du Bois, Harry Hayward, Alain Locke, as well as Ida B. Wells Barnett, Lucy Parsons, Anna Julia Cooper, and Claudia Jones that inform incipient thesis of Black cultural revolution and shows how these early formulations influence later ones of Harold Cruz's, James and Grace Lee Boggs, and most significantly, Malcolm X, whose revolutionary thesis influenced the Revolutionary Action Movement, US, the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, the Congress of African Peoples, and the Shrine of the Black Madonna, each of which is examined in the book. It notes that uh, black it notes that BPM revolutionists did not adopt the cultural revolutionary thesis of their predecessors, settling instead for examples from abroad that hardly fit their peculiar context of Black America, and as a result failed to successfully theorize their own movement. It maintains that given the persistence of many of the challenges that the BPM revolution is confronted, thesis on Black cultural revolution remain relevant for present activism such as Black Lives Matter. Henderson was born and raised in Brewster Projects on the Near East Side of Detroit. He was a noted student and community activist, and he helped lead 2 successful student movements, the first in 1987 in response to racist threats against Black women on campus of the University of Michigan, led to profound changes at the university. Henderson also helped lead an extended protest that included an 11-day building occupation at Wayne State University in 1989 that led to the creation of a long sought-after Department of Africana Studies. Henderson served as the director of the Peace Program for community-based nonprofit organizations Save Our Sons and Daughters, which consisted of families and friends of children killed in Detroit. Henderson organized, developed, and extended the peace programs under the leadership of Save Our Sons and Daughters founder Clementine Barfield, who was the survivor of her teenage child's homicide. He helped establish Save Our Sons and Daughters chapters throughout the country and participated in the National Urban Peace and Justice Summit in 1993 that brought together over 200 gang members from 22 different cities to attempt to implement a national truce. Henderson is also an original co-sponsor of the Liberation Film Series at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, Michigan. The Liberation Film Series is an acclaimed, nationally recognized film and lecture series that promotes literacy, intellectual independence, critical analysis, and informed activism, and engages grassroots youth, family, community-based organizations, and scholar activists in educational films and community conversations of contemporary relevance that focus on creating learning opportunities, increase clarity, and new solutions to current and emerging social political changes. Notably, Henderson served as a moderator for the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party, featuring Kathleen Cleaver, Communications Secretary of the Black Panther Party, which was in February of 2016. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to some and introduce to others, Dr. Errol Henderson. Dr. Henderson, welcome.
Thank you very much. Wow, I didn't expect you to read all that, but thank you very much. The pronunciation of my first name is Errol. Errol. My name is Errol Henderson.
Apologies.
You call me Errol. That's fine. Yeah, thank you very much. I want to thank the organization for inviting me as well. And I wanted to just to commend you on the excellent work you've been doing. I've followed up. I've looked up some of the videos, and it's just inspirational. And best of luck on the upcoming program, which I've shared information about it before when you sent it to me, brother. And I'll make a point to share more as the date gets near. And I just have one question. It's a virtual program, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. It's going to be done via Zoom on August 8th and the 9th.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. But I hope we can turn this into something more, something like a discussion, and give an overview of the book, and then take it wherever you all want to take it. Okay. But to just introduce it, one of the things that guided this work was I was taught by many of the folks who are involved in the Black Power movement. My older sister was a member of Detroit's Black Panther Party. I had long friendships with folks like Mario Bedelli, and I've known brothers like Muhammad Ahmed, who's still there in Philly and still kicking. I talked to him just last week. But also been tutored by folks like Queen Mother Moore, and Dara Abubakari, Akua and Jerry in the Illinois Black Panther Party, General Baker and Marion Kramer of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. So I was always, my activism doesn't arise till the early 80s. So I want to make it clear where my spirit was in writing this book. One thing that struck me as I learned about them, James and Grace Lee Boggs, other folks I've known since the 80s, was that these folks not only were participants in the Black liberation struggle, they strategized. You see, and I operate on just some basic tenets. Being from the Brewster Projects on the east side of Detroit, that's where I was born. I wasn't born in the hospital. I was born in the projects. Okay? And one of the things that we learned early is the people that won't treat you right, just like the old head said, people who won't treat you right won't teach you right. And one of the things that's important to understand that white supremacism will not just teach you what to think, it'll teach you how to think. So one thing that struck me about these brothers and sisters is that they also strategized what they were doing. They not only participated, they planned, they organized. But this is the reason why we're here now. We were 4 million in 1860, we're 40 million now. We're not here because of the good graces of white people. We're here because we struggled, but we also strategized, theorized, and made revolution. And the key revolution I argue we made is the slave revolution during the US Civil War. We'll come back to that. But what struck me was that they theorized as well as participated. Remember, David Hilliard said that in his book on the Panther Party. He said the white left wanted us for our thuggery, but not our theory. He put it like that. Okay? But it's Malcolm who makes it clear that when he calls for political revolution, he argues that blacks in the United States required a cultural revolution as well. He said in different contexts, a cultural revolution to unbrainwash a whole generation of black folks. Okay. But he appreciated that there were these two, the political revolution and the cultural revolution. And I hope folks will ask about that, because part of this was demystifying what those things were. Okay, what the book starts with Malcolm and the political theory of Malcolm, with the understanding that I'm not saying all these folks were theorists, don't get me wrong. And I'm not trying to impose theory on activists. What I'm saying is they strategized, they organized, they created the Underground Railroad. They created the mechanism that was a clandestine mechanism, secret mechanism that would transport the major source of wealth that white folks had, which was us. See what I'm saying? And they did that over decades. They had some strategy for doing this. They comprised it. And what was central to me was that these activists seem to understand these strategies and build on them. We start with Malcolm. Malcolm argues that you need a political revolution in the United States, but his thesis was constantly focused on both a political revolution in the United States that was part of what he called the worldwide revolution, but also a cultural revolution in the United States. Now, Malcolm theorized the political revolution. We could talk about that if you want, or as you like. But the cultural revolution, he didn't develop it, though he thought it was essential. To understand this, the centrality of cultural revolution for Black Americans, it's important to understand, unlike many other people involved in revolution, Black folks were denied our culture. So it's really not until 1903 that you have this statement coming from Du Bois. I'm saying no later than. I'm not saying he originated it, but no later than. When the argument is that African Americans have a culture in the souls of Black folk, and then later in the Negro and Black folk then and now. But he's going to make the thesis that Africa has cultures, historic cultures. Some of the earliest Afrocentric arguments are going to come from Du Bois. Is epitomized in his 1933 address at Fisk University. But this one in 1903, where he's talking about this. He says not only is Africa the mother of civilization, as Du Bois saw it, but African Americans have a civilization as well. In fact, the only real culture that's American culture, he argues, is the African culture within the American body politic. So I want you to appreciate, I'm not talking about Native Americans now. So he's talking about in America body politic. So he says much of the white culture is derivative from Europe. So now this is part of the challenge. Du Bois is arguing this, that Black folks have a culture. Remember, we were people who were denied even faced death just to learn to read and write. So he's arguing that Black folks had a culture. Many Black folks didn't think that Black folks had a culture, and overwhelmingly white folks did. But what Du Bois did, when he started talking about culture and Black people, this created what we call modern Black nationalism. Modern Black nationalism is a Black cultural nationalism, one that recognizes that we have a culture. Now contrast that. Many of the Black nationalists of the 19th century, I'm not mad at them, I'm trying to build on their work. Sometimes folks want to make this work as if it's a finished product, instead of critically assessing it to build on it, okay? Many of the 19th century Black nationalists, they were, and we need to be clear, Black nationalism is the original ideology of Black folks in this country. It's the oldest one. It doesn't start in the 19th century, it started in the 18th, okay? We have some of the early, and we can talk about that, and I talk about this in the book, and that's why there's a whole chapter just on Black nationalism. But many of the Black nationalists, Delaney, Garnett, Crummell, they argued that African Americans needed to go to Africa to liberate Africa from colonial rule, also to fight to work as a base from Africa to undermine American slavery. But they also had this view, which Wilson Moses calls as a civilizationist view. He calls it civilizationist, that argued that Africans also had to bring the technology that was dominated by whites, especially military technology, but a range of technologies to Africans. And then they often took this view that Africans needed to be civilized, and the diasporic Africans were going to do the civilizing. I call that, what Wilson Moses called that civilizationism. And Du Bois is challenging that, okay? And others like Alain Locke. And we can talk about where Garvey fits in this too. This is why Moses says Garvey has 1 foot in the 20th century, but 1 foot in the 19th. We'll come back to that. But civilizationism, the idea that Blacks in the diaspora were going to bring civilization to the Africans. Okay? Malcolm is going to reverse that. Remember, Malcolm says, he looks at the African independence movement, he said they're getting their freedom much quicker than we are. They're actually talking about creating states. They were talking about independence. They're not talking about sitting next to somebody on a lunch counter. They're talking about freedom. They're talking about liberation. They're talking about sovereignty. They're talking about statehood. See? That's why Malcolm say, or the brothers and sisters asked what they left there. I said, you left your mind in Africa. See? But some folks took that too literally, I would argue. But Malcolm thought that Black Africans were more advanced than African Americans. And he associated that with their greater cultural identity, their sense of cultural Africanness that he saw in the different colonies, but also in the different nations in Africa. And they're not the same thing, of course. But so he thought that African Americans were behind Africans, that Africans were more advanced, and because they were more culturally grounded, they were more politically grounded. It's a very Diopian connection between cultural independence and political independence. So Malcolm thought that African Americans were behind Africa. The reverse of the civilizationist arguments from the 19th century. So I call this reverse civilizationist. Malcolm thought African Americans had to follow Africa. I argue this is Malcolm's biggest theoretical flaw. the reverse civilizationism. And the reason why is because Malcolm's killed before he's 40 years old. He doesn't develop it. So again, I keep saying this, folks. I'm not mad at them. I'm trying to build on their work. You see? So Malcolm left this work to us. He said these words exactly. We'll call on students of political science. See what I'm saying? To offer us their analysis. But he's talking about building on Malcolm's work. So Malcolm reversed this. And I argue this was something that many of the members of the Black Power movement picked up on uncritically. And I think that was unfortunate. So you had folks like groups like RAM that accepted some of the reverse civilizationism, but especially how it impacted their theory. They thought they could wage an anti-colonial struggle in the United States the way it was being waged in the so-called third world and in Africa, in a colonial context that was not like the United States. And plus that they're going to wage this revolution in the most powerful country in the world with people who are African Americans and not African. This was key as well, because the differences were important. If there's difference between, and there are, between Fulani and Kikuyu, there's darn sure differences between Xhosa and African American. You see what I'm saying? So we're talking about the culture you're going to draw on to wear to your political objectives to make revolution. So I would argue that RAM, us organization even more, us went back to a type of African culture that was really an amalgam of several types of cultures. And we can talk about that, but they didn't speak to what was African American. African American culture is not it's not overly communal. It's not overly rural, even though it was predominantly rural still in the 60s. But we're an urban, cosmopolitan culture of African Americans that Du Bois and Locke are seeing this in the early 20th century, and so is Garvey. And this is what Garvey is brilliant at taking advantage of. And I mean this programmatically, is to see the urbanization and to use this. And this is one of the reasons why Garvey spent so much time talking about the Irish Revolution and lauding folks like Casement and others. But to use the urban the urban energy, the urban orientation of Black America. But let me move on. So us organization took on another a type of African culture that I argue was largely feudal, in its conception. The RNA would take on certain aspects of it. What's the group that challenged it? The group that challenged that's the Panther Party. But unfortunately, the Panther Party elevated a type of lumpen subculture, lumpen proletariat. We can talk about it if you like. Talking about brothers and sisters on the block. It's really the League of Revolutionary Black Workers that captures this sense of Black urban culture, and it's really Black industrial culture where we are. And there's a range of cultures too, as subcultures within Black communities. It's really the League, which is ironic because the League was a Black Marxist organization. And I argue in the book that and make a strong critique of Marxist, or just like Du Bois, why Marxism doesn't account for analytically. It's not a useful device for explaining Black or even American national development. We can talk about that if you like. But what the League did in organizing in the plants, and at the same time they're out of plant organizing, when they married those two, what they were doing inadvertently was wedding themselves to the same process our ancestors used. Our ancestors got their liberation because they fought for it. 196,000 Black people fought in the US Civil War. A greater proportion of Blacks fought in the US Civil War than white men from the North. Even in that racist period of time, there were 16 Medal of Honor recipients. Think of that. Okay. But the key was they fought, and Du Bois argued this in Black Reconstruction in 1935. They fought motivated by utilizing the religious arguments, just as Gabriel had, just as Demont Vesey had, just as Nat Turner had, religious arguments, but it was wedded to a process that's called slave hiring. And if you're interested in that, we can talk about that. Again, all this is in the book. And what they did, they wedded the two to create an orientation and an organization that was set up, a network of enslaved Africans who would then join the Union Army to fight and kill their former slave masters. Sometimes when I say things like that, people say like, well, brother, how you gonna have a, fight for Black liberation and you're allied with the white supremacist Union Army? Well, you show me a war you don't have allies with. It goes back to Lord Palmerston. He said Britain has no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. If your interest is your freedom, and you try to get your freedom, you may ally with someone that you have no other interest in, except if they want to help you with their freedom. It's not because you plan to, it's an alliance, it's not a wedding. You see what I'm saying? So again, thinking strategically. What did they do? They made the Civil War, they turned it into a revolution. Neither the North or the South had as its original war aims the ending of chattel slavery. Neither one of them wanted that. The Confederacy didn't want it, neither did Lincoln. We changed that. How did we do that? Well, there's a discussion in the book, and I explain this. But more than that, Du Bois explained this in 1935 in Black Reconstruction. But this is one of the main books I said that's understudied. It's often dismissed. One of my professors at Michigan was Harold Cruz. And Harold Cruz is arguing this in The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. He used to say, Henderson, you got to read, when I was a grad student, he said, you got to read the Black Reconstruction. I said, Professor Cruz, it's 600 pages. He used to curse a lot. I won't curse. But he said, you ain't got to, well, I make it look. He said, you ain't got to read the whole damn thing, just the first chapter. And he's right. As you read just the first chapter, you'll see. If you don't believe me, Steve Hines at University of Pennsylvania, Du Bois' book written in 1935, okay, he says what blacks did was they created a revolution that was more significant, the most significant revolution of labor until the Bolshevik Revolution. That's what he writes in Black Reconstruction. Steve Hines, right damn near the same thing in 2004, he get a Pulitzer Prize. Now, he's a white guy, he teaches at UPenn. So if you don't like my reference to Du Bois, not you folks here, if somebody don't like my reference to Du Bois, Steve Hines says the same thing. Stephanie McCurry, a white scholar, talked about the Confederacy themselves. When you look at the actual documents from 1861, 1865, the slave masters are saying things like this: my slaves are in revolt. And Stephanie McCurry documents this in a book called Confederate Reckoning. You know what I'm saying? It's not a mystery to this. Steve Hahn also writes in this book, in the Political Worlds of Slavery and Freedom. He's got a chapter in here where he makes it clear that the slave revolution in the U.S. was probably the most significant slave revolution in the modern era, even more important than the Haitian Revolution. I don't go that far, but that's Steve Hahn. That's the Pulitzer Prize winning guy, okay? Du Bois says this in 1935. It's largely ignored. The strategy is what's important to me. The strategy. What was the strategy that was used? So now, jumping ahead, coming to the 60s, Harold Cruz says, in the United States, what's necessary is for blacks to have a cultural revolution that would then implicate the political and economic. What's the basic logic to that? Look, you don't go straight for the political. You're not going to outflank them politically. You'll be channeled into the political parties, and you're not going to outflank them militarily, literally. In the you're getting waylaid by local police forces. You're not going to defeat the guard or the reserves, and darn sure not the regular army, the regular military. He says you don't do political. You don't do it economic. What's the basic economic one? Big bank take little bank. That's the logic. It's the cultural front. Imagine if you tap on the culture, because we can create that. We can produce that ourselves. We produce it not just in music and sports, etc., but we can raise cultural contradictions where we have standing in order to do what? In order to implicate political and economic change. It go like this. Look, if you challenge a statue, a Confederate statue, okay, the Confederate statue is on the in the public space, okay, Confederate statue, what's that going to do about white supremacy? Well, you're going to challenge it. It's a cultural challenge. You challenge that. You have standing there, talking about black folks, that's standing there. But then the issue becomes the statue. Yeah, who put it there? Who got to put it there? Who made the political decision to put it there? So now we want representation there, okay? Now, who funded this? Where does the funds come for the economic, for this statuary? So we want representation there. What he's trying to show is how the cultural, where you have standing, can spin off into the political and economic. But if you just go straight for the political and economic, you probably will be outflanked or you'll be co-opted. This is what Cruz is saying for the civil rights movement to become revolutionary, that it needs to implicate the cultural, make it even plainer. Remember when the Black Power emerges, just like Black Lives Matter today. Remember when Black Power emerges, SNCC and CORE, they kicked the white folks out. They want Black Power. And of course, white money left as well. Right? So imagine if at the same time, you had a class action lawsuit from black entertainers. I'm talking about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Big Mama Thornton, all these black entertainers who've been ripped off by these white-owned music companies, etc. The NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, they take the case, a class action suit. We definitely got standing there. You got in the 1960s, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, they putting Howlin' Wolf on stage. It's clear where they get the music from. You know what I'm saying? Black folks have now you say, a class action suit, but it's already agreed that 10% of that money is going to go where? To SNCC and court. Use culture for your economic base. Use culture to implicate the political and economic. And where are you headed with this? Where you headed with this is the major unresolved issue of social justice in the United States. Our people fought for the major unresolved issue of social justice at the time, overthrowing chattel slavery, and we did that. We won that. Don't let people convince you you didn't win because we lost Reconstruction. That's the example I use, brother, on the radio. I said, you in Philly there, you have folks like Joe Frazier, heavyweight champion, you know what I'm saying? Instead of that clown that's down at the library, right, that we got a statue of, who never even learned the boxing. But Joe Frazier, a Philly champion. Joe Frazier win the heavyweight championship in the ring. Well, if on the way home, somebody robbed Joe and take his belt, well, Joe's still the heavyweight champion. He won it in the ring. We won the slave revolution. And then our allies sold us out to by 1877, you have the end of Reconstruction. But the reason why we don't learn that in school, go back to where I started. The people who won't treat you right won't teach you right. If I teach you how to win, or that you won, you may actually go there trying to draw lessons for your next victory. The best way to keep you from looking at your actual victories is to convince you that you have none. That's why I don't subscribe to things like, the new Jim Crow. I don't like that language. We defeated Jim Crow. White supremacists created another system after that. If you know you won, you can go back and take the strategy that brought you victory. Except this time you can make sure you don't lose the peace as well. But don't be confused to think you didn't win. That's a strategy to make sure you don't look to your victories for actual strategies to defeat these white supremacists, you see? And that's why it's so important when I say—
So let me jump. I'm taking a lot of notes here because you bringing up a lot of points, but talking about past wins, I wanna take the conversation towards Nat Turner and strategy. When we had our call, you mentioned that Nat Turner was very strategic, so much so that some of the folks on the plantation were referring to Nat Turner as a coon or as a sellout. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Nat Turner learned from he was he didn't have special skills like Gabriel and Denmark Vesey, who had skills and put very skilled folks around them, mostly blacksmiths. The key about blacksmiths and artisans, they made tools, so they made weapons. But that's not only that. Remember, one of the most famous blacksmiths was Frederick Douglass. They were also hired out. When they were hired out, and often folks don't appreciate this in slavery, slave masters who had slaves with certain talents could hire them out to local industries, and then of course they would take the slaves' wages. But the enslaved Africans would be working there, often with free people, including white people, to create products that were needed for industry. So remember, Frederick Douglass says, Dr. Frederick Douglass is enslaved. And he says when he saw at the end of the month, when the other folks were getting their wages and his master took him, he said, this is almost verbatim. He says he realized then that his master was robbing him. Now think about it, he's enslaved, right? But he knows his work, the value of his work. I don't need a Marxist labor theory of value. Listen to Fred, what he's telling you. He realizes the exploitation and the extent of the exploitation beyond slave, but also his sense of being a worker. Working class consciousness doesn't come here in the US from Marxism. It comes from the study of black workers, enslaved black folks. That's where they are. Okay, now back to Nat. So Nat is a worker, but he's also a preacher. Nat at one time escapes. And when he escapes, the other those in the slave quarters applauded Nat for his success. He escaped successfully, but he came back. See, Nat Turner thought he had a broader destiny. When he came back, they looked at Nat as a sellout. How did you got away? They couldn't find it, but he came back anyway. And I don't know for sure. I don't think anyone knows for sure. But Nat Turner, he was deliberate. He appreciated, because there was word of these other revolts. He appreciated that they were often betrayed. Gabriel's plot was betrayed. So was Denmark Vesey. And it was ironically a blacksmith among those in Denmark Vesey. But Nat Turner only told 4 people, you see? And he wanted to keep it close. So Nat Turner was a strategist. The reason why Nat Turner is using clubs and knives for his assaults early on is because they began at what we used to call 0 dark 30. They began 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Their attacks then under the cover of night. You see, they're attacking then. But when daybreak, Nat Turner puts red bandanas on his troops, gets horses, and then charges. You see, Nat Turner was one bridge away from making it to the Dismal Swamp. One bridge away. And if he would have got his forces to the Dismal Swamp, they wouldn't find him today. I'm exaggerating. But that would have been a place where he could have operated using the similar guerrilla tactics that people hail today. But if I can convince you that Nat Turner is a madman, he's a rapist, he wants to find white women, if I convince you that that's all he is, you'll never go and study Nat. And to study his victories, his successes, his strategic and tactical successes, and his errors. But if I convince you he's a man, you won't even look. So that's so important to remember. Two things: a people that won't treat you right, won't teach you right, and white supremacism not just teach you what to think, but how to think. Why would I go to Nat Turner looking for liberation? What he got to tell? Who trained you to believe that? You didn't get it from Nat, I guarantee you that. Why would I go to the Civil War looking for liberation? Look at where we at now. Who trained you to think that way? You see? So that's part of the challenge. I'll try to be succinct so you can ask other questions.
All right.
And all of this is in the book. All of this in the book, I say, and the book is free online. That's one of the things that get me so much when people come in here. They got a class analysis of this. They got a class analysis of everything except their book. They still don't know how to make their book free. So it's free. Anybody can read it online. Okay. And the book that came after that is free as well. I'm not knocking people who sell books. Don't get me wrong. But if a professor comes and tell you they haven't tried to make their book free, I got a problem with that. And that's from growing up poor. You know what I'm saying? It's how do you make these things accessible to folks? And some people say like, well, Brother Errol, how you gonna do that? How you gonna have folks in the projects reading your word? You got words in there, you got big words. I said, first of all, I'm a brother from the projects, okay? That's the first part. I don't know what you think about folks from the projects. But the other part is, every Sunday, black folks reading words, and some of them I still don't know what it is. What the hell is an Ecclesiastes? I don't know what a Thessalonian is to this day, brother. So we can handle words. They got dictionaries, brother. But please.
So somebody in the chat just asked, and this question comes from Brother Rich. It says, can you speak to the Grapevine Telegraph as the communication network that was used for the success of the general strike?
Sure. Booker T. Washington talks about this. Remember, Booker T. Washington was formerly enslaved. And Booker T. Washington talking about this. And just an aside, what about Booker T? I see me talking about the boys, Garvey. It strikes me when black folks like to tell you, well, which one, Brother Errol? It's like, you in a country that glamorizes white supremacists, sexist, patriarchal, rapist oligarchs. They call them the founders, okay? Plural. Folks not sitting here saying like, which one you gonna take? Because you only get one. But that's what people tell me. Malcolm or Martin, you only get one. No, reject that. Take them all. But because I'm not trying to take these people home with me, I'm talking about their strategies and strategies we can use today. So back to the Grapevine Telegraph. And this is where it comes from Marvin Gaye. I'm from Detroit. I'm crazy about Motown. But I heard it through the Grapevine, the whole nine. That's where it's from. The Grapevine Telegraph. Well, this was the informal network of enslaved Africans who would transmit information from their slave masters just because when we were treated well, we were treated like furniture. That is something that's there, but it's not conscious. So when we'd have someone who would go and fetch the mail from the post office, and the person would go, or a drayman would go and take them, or a coachman would go, and they would pick it up, and they would pick up the conversation that was being had by the whites in and near the postal office. And then when they come back and deliver the mail to the big house, they were often, again, they were there. So when the discussion is being had over dinner, etc., the blacks would relay this back to the slave quarters. It's just a common set of networks. If you want a richer analysis, this is a book by Anthony Kay. I cited it in the book, and I talk about the networks of enslaved Africans as well. It's called Joining Places. Anthony Kay, who was a professor here, unfortunately he died young. And it talks about these networks. In fact, if you look at the slave networks, as opposed to simply the plantations, you can actually predict how far slave revolts would go, because slaves created their own types of neighborhoods that often expanded beyond plantations. And the Grapevine Telegraph was a communications network that enslaved Africans used, and they built on this stronger communications networks. How do we know? People like William Webb, who was a formerly enslaved, and he talks about this in his autobiography in 1873. And he talks about this, how, and I talk about it in the book, they set up what they call these depots 12 miles apart, where couriers could generate information during the presidential campaign prior to Lincoln at 12-mile increments. And each one at the 12-mile increments would be headed by what he called a king bee. So they could send information over he said at its height, they could send information over 2 states. This was the structure of what was the Underground Railroad. Look here, Underground Railroad didn't operate on no magic quilts or magic blankets. That's not how it worked. We know how it worked because we have folks, a lot of them right there in Philly with William Steele and the Vigilante Society, a lot of them right there who documented. There's a brother down at Vanderbilt named Bartlett who talks about these blacks who escaped from enslavement, who then told of the ways they escaped and the to the degree they could to demystify this. But it really wasn't until 1896 and a cat named Alfred Bergston who wrote a book, and that's when everybody named Mama, most of these white folks started swearing that they hid enslaved Africans in their attics and just BS. We made the Underground Railroad, and we did that clandestine organization, and we set that up, and it moved tens of thousands of enslaved Africans to their liberation, and they did it secretly. You know what I'm saying? And that's key to understand too about strategies.
Yeah, it's just funny how they rewrite history to center themselves. When you read the works of folks like Martin Delany, when he's saying that we were the abolitionists, these white folks, they were the Johnny come latelys trying to call themselves abolitionists. So it's the same thing with the Underground Railroad. We were freeing ourselves, and these white people, they come and now they try to center themselves, in our liberation. But I want to pivot back to something you said earlier. You said that Black nationalism is the original ideology of the people in this country. And as a dovetail or caveat to that, you've mentioned that, I guess I'm paraphrasing here, but you said that Marxism is not useful. And I don't know if you said political perspective. I don't know your exact statement, but I want to ask, when did that, in your estimation, when did that split come where you get like the development of the Black left or the internationalists as opposed to the Black nationalists? I would think that it goes back to the Garvey movement and the African Blood Brothers. You see the beginning of it there, but in your summation, where do you see that split coming?
Well, the first is I don't see it as a split. I find Black internationalism a redundancy when talking about Black nationalism. First Black nationalists in the 18th century. So this goes back to Prince Hall's petition in Newport. I believe that's 1773. I have to check my date, but it's in the book.
1793.
I'm sorry?
I think it's 1793.
Okay. And he's making he's petitioning for the return of several of himself and several others. He wants support from the government, the local government, to return to for a passage to return to Africa. Okay? That's what he wants. Okay. Now, but Paul Cuffey had also made this argument much earlier. Paul Cuffey had argued for it's 1773. Yes, that was his appeal to free Africans in Boston. Mm-hmm. In 1787 was when that's the first appeal. 1773. That's from the first immigrationist appeal of free Africans in Boston. And they wanted to just set aside a week so they could earn money to return to Africa. 1787 was when Prince Hall led the delegation that petitioned Massachusetts for a resettlement in Africa. Okay, and then Cuffey Cuffey actually argued for specific allotments of land in the continental United States, as well as support to return to Africa. So he really lays out what will eventually become what the Republic of New Africa calls the four fundamental consequences of freedom. Okay, these are all folks arguing for a black nation. Black nationalism is simply the view, like all nationalism, nationalism is that the political and the social should be congruent. That is, a society should be able to determine its form of governance. A society should determine its polity. Okay? And black nationalism doesn't have to aspire to the possession of the state. That's one type. You can have a degree of autonomy within a federation, for example. Okay, and you can be a black nationalist and agree to live in a multinational democracy as well. So that the consequence of black nationalism, but nationalism is simply this view that the social and the political should be congruent. Each society should be able to determine its own form of government. Now, the reason internationalism is redundant is what I just said. So I'm talking about, we got here from an international process. The first black nationalists are fighting internationally to get to Africa, to have an independent nation here, both to have an independent nation not here somewhere else, like Mary Shad Carey. Not black nationalism subsumes this. Black nationalism subsumes a certain type of Pan-Africanism. You see, so but black nationalism and internationalism is often used. Internationalism is often used to deny the international aspects of black nationalism, which is just ahistorical. How you gonna get black nationalism within the United States without an international analysis? That's why you raise these examples. Not even from the 19th century; those are from the 18th century. These appeals are international appeals, and they're analysis of international relations. That's what these black folks are doing. Okay, so so I want to make that clear. It's not so much a split. In Marxism, it's not invented yet. Where Marx intervenes is in the U.S. Civil War, sending letters to Lincoln, etc. And then a couple of phrases in his writing that Marxists blow out of all proportion because he didn't have an analysis of the United States. This is what Du Bois argued. Du Bois went through his Marxist phase and will return to one when he gets back to Ghana. But I argue that's mainly out of spite against the United States that won't allow him to travel. But during the phase where he was, and Du Bois called himself a socialist of the past from 1907, again, which makes it ridiculous when people just reduce him to the talented 10th. He sees himself as a socialist in 1907. Socialist is not talking about the talented 10th. And even in his own writings, he turns it into the guiding 100, so at least get the fraction right by the 1930s. Okay, but anyway, it again shows you how much folks reduce some of our now to slogans or tokens, and they haven't done any rich analysis of our folks' theory. Let me stay on point. So the internationalism emerges, especially after the Civil War, and there's a lot of German influence. That's one thing Django Unchained got right. There's a lot of German influence because you have the wars in for national unification in 1848, the uprisings throughout 1848. So you have Germans who are coming here who are fighting for much more socialistic orientations, because those types of things go back to the Fabian Society. So they're much richer than Marxism. Marxism makes a specific separation from other forms of socialism. But here's the key. Then when Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction, he's arguing that the general strike of the Civil War, he said blacks orchestrated what he called a general strike. You've heard this maxim before: our army travels on its belly. What happens to the Confederacy if it's no longer fed? Who's feeding the Confederacy? The enslaved Africans. Du Bois said they struck. They didn't just say they didn't want to work. They struck. Over 300,000 of them. They stopped providing. That's why it's only at the very end, Robert E. Lee is saying we have to commission these enslaved Africans, our slaves, as he would call them, and give them arms. That's what Robert E. Lee is trying to do, but he's doing it much too late. Okay? But back to this. So what Du Bois is saying is that the understanding of workers in the U.S. must focus on the black worker, but the black worker is an enslaved worker, and the white worker betrayed any type of unity. This is part of the betrayal. We often focus on the elites during the Hayes-Tilden sellout of 1877, but the white worker, he'd rather burn up a Negro orphanage in New York instead of fighting in the Civil War, in what he would call a quote, a nigger war. You know, that's not what they want to fight for. Excuse the language, but I'm being consistent with the time, okay? Before somebody charged me with using a racial slur, okay? But being consistent with the time. And they would kill black orphans in New York. You see what I'm saying? They would rather kill blacks than to fight for what they perceived as what was then becoming the end of slavery. So this was the betrayal that Du Bois saw, and the separation between the black and white workers. I would argue Marxists were doing a very poor job of even analyzing that. And you really don't get that engagement until you get Harry Haywood. And that goes to just what you said, brother. That's the African Blood Brotherhood and Harry Haywood. And that's why I talk about him in the book. But I also talk about the intervening between those is Sister and the leadership of the of Sister Callie House in the Ex-Slave Bounty and Pension Association. These are some 300,000 former enslaved Africans who were fighting for their pensions. They wanted their pensions from slavery. And Callie House became the second leader of it. And to the distinction between Callie House and someone like Emma Goldman, the noted socialist, I think they're in prison at the same time. And I think Emma Goldman may have made a comment that Callie House did her wash at one time. But Callie House is often forgotten and Emma Goldman is lauded. But what Callie House is doing, that's the organization of workers that are fighting for their pensions. And that issue is the major unresolved issue we face today, which of course is reparations. So, and if Marxists were serious about studying this, they would see that the challenge for reparations will actually create what they call this crisis of capitalism. Because one thing capitalists have shown is that they can survive crisis. I often say if one thing Marxism didn't appreciate is that capitalists learn, and they learn from the Great Depression, you know what I'm saying? And it's not just so many white workers out there hungry, but when you had the bonus marchers, when their veterans from World War I were marching and occupying Washington in the early 1930s, and it was Douglas MacArthur who would then remove them. When they saw their veterans, overwhelmingly white, but white and black as well, when they saw them, that's when they said, we must create an economic floor below which our citizens won't fall, our white citizens, and especially our veterans, the ones who have armed and shown their ability and willingness to fight, especially after they went to Washington in 1933-34 and camped out. Where do you think we got it from? The March on Washington, not going there just because that's the capital, but what the bonus marchers done, and many of those bonus marchers were black, you see? So it's important to put this in context. So it's not a split because we were together at one point. No, but no. The competition was often with socialism, with people like Chandler Owen but also with interesting enough with people like Ida B. Wells. Sister Ida would go wherever they were talking about liberation, and Sister Ida would call them out left and right if they weren't about liberation. She's writing about lynching in 1892 in the South. You see what I'm saying? So Ida B. Wells is doing systematic study of the sociology of lynching before Du Bois, and Du Bois does the first quantitative sociological analysis in the United States, the Philadelphia Negro, 1899. But Sister Ida's doing this in 1892, the Southern Horrors and the Red Record. She's compiling this from interviews. That's when she's coming out and showing that even by their own admission, the lynchers are saying they're not doing this in protection of white women's virtue. They're doing this mostly for economic reasons. So again, I would challenge the notion that they were together in that sense, but the main split has occurred, just like you said, brother, with the African Blood Brotherhood, because that's when you get the beginning of the Communist Party USA and the split. Remember, the Communist Party USA supports Haywood's Black Belt thesis, but they're going to eventually expel him from the party for what? The same thing they call Black Nazi. They call him, they said he was too chauvinistic about the Negro. And he wrote a classic book, Negro and Liberation, in 1948. Harry Haywood was brilliant. Remember the African Blood Brotherhood at one time. And he was one of the first African Americans to go to the Ho Chi Minh School of toilers in the East that the Soviets sent there. And he's still alive during the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. So I talk about him in the book, and also the person who pushed his thesis to its extent, which I argue that many Marxists have not gone beyond. In 1948, on the empirical neglect of the Black woman, is Claudia Jones, who also has a Marxist feminist analysis that also, and this is Marxists that though recognize as Black nationhood, See, Harry Haywood is talking about Black culture. He's talking about the Black nation. And that's why they're going to kick him out of the Communist Party. And they kick him out right at the end of the 1950s. And it's one of the reasons why the Communist Party USA is utterly irrelevant to the civil rights movement. And they don't come back until really Black folks bring them back. And that's largely through the Black Panther Party. Well, yeah, let me stop there. I would say RAM. You can say RAM as well.
Yeah, would you say that the ability of the Communist Party USA to find its way back into our memory is due to that lack of institutional memory within our and I mean for them to find their way back into our movement is due to the lack of institutional memory within our movement. And what I say is that if you look at like the 30s, the 60s, the 90s, you see the youth, you know, meaning the young people of these epochs doing the same things that, you know, were being done 30 and 60 years before them, as if they didn't have knowledge of some of these, I guess, conflicts and betrayals that had occurred before.
Well, some of this is generational. Yes. Institutional, but it's all. Who you gonna go to for an ally? Costa Rica? I mean, they go to the Soviet Union, and what's the Soviet Union pushing? They push Marxism. You see, they got resources. They got the same thing. Many of the Marxists say about the Black church. They say the Black church wasn't as important. It's just the place where Black folks could congregate safely. Well, many of these Marxists, they hardly studied Marxists, many of the Black Marxists, and the white ones too, don't get me wrong, but they were critical of U.S. domestic policy and international policy, so they went there because the resources were there. But a lot of it is, like you say, some of this, the institutional memory and the undermining and the oppression. There's a reason why we don't have, we often suffer to maintain consistency across decades. It's because of repression. So the institutions are destroyed, they're undermined, the people are jailed. That's why I bring up Callie House. Callie House is in prison. You know what I'm saying? This the so this is why I bring. It's not to. I'm not trying to glamorize. Not that there's any glamour in that. Don't get me wrong. But they're repressed. So I'm not mad at the folks who come up again because they're still coming up against it under the white supremacism that often convinces other people that there's no need to do it, or there's no hope in doing it, or you're wasting your time doing it. So I still. That's why I keep saying I'm not mad at these folks. I want to understand it. So that we can, again, strategize so that what happens now is different. Let me give an example. We have protests here I'm in State College, Pennsylvania. Y'all in Philly, so you know something, State College is Central Pennsylvania. You know what this is, Mississippi in the middle, right? So, you know, it's overwhelmingly white, you know this place here, okay? So we have overwhelmingly white folks out here marching for Black Lives Matter. And what I share with folks here, some of my friends in Philly, and some of my folks I organized with in Detroit and out in Oakland and in Atlanta. And I said, I shared the historical context of the Black folks and white folks, but also for the white folks and Black folks. I said, the white folks, in '64, the Freedom Summer invited whites to the South for a strategic reason. They knew the cameras would come, they knew the resources would come, and they knew the contradictions would be heightened with whites in the South, and they invite them. I tell the white folks, I said, you didn't wait on an invitation, see? And you're here. So don't let nobody minimize what you're doing, especially none of them white racists you left at home who ain't here with you. You know what I'm saying? And that's my best English, who ain't here with you. Don't let them minimize what you're doing. So to apply the lessons learned so you can apply novel strategies to the novel conditions you're often facing. And that's what I say. Remember when I started, I'm not mad at Malcolm. Malcolm was doing incredible work. And they also doing all types of other work. But in all that, they still theorize. But to build on his work, you show respect and appreciation, not trying to make him into something that he wasn't. Hey, the king of this, the king. Come on, stop that. But to build on him, still appreciate him, folks even love him. But to build on his work, I think that shows respect and appreciation, not turning it into something that you then make into a new type of religion. You know, that's not what I'm about, and that's not what I find these other folks are about either. So I think it's important to put that in context, and also the Marxists dominate universities. Ask yourself, how many universities you have that have black nationalists or folks who talk like me at major universities? You can find a Marxist in every sociology department in the United States. How is this the revolutionary thesis is going to overturn the United States? And they teach it all through the country. You know what I'm saying? It's the house. What do you call it? These are the house rebels. They are going to do, what's the technical word? They're not going to do a damn thing. And the ones that are often do what? They come back. Huey says, when we distance ourselves from the Black Panther Party, he says, when we distance ourselves from the black church, we were distancing ourselves from the black community. You know what I'm saying? You can't go through the South talking about dialectical materialism. You better have some Jesus on that.
It's interesting to see that evolution and the thinking of many of our leaders and those theoreticians who've analyzed and strategized against this problem, because you always see, like, at the end of their arc, they always come back and say, oh, well, we made a mistake by separating ourselves from the black community. But I wanted to draw back on something that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, and this was related to.
One thing, brother, because I forget. Can I say one thing, brother Omawali, on your point?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Because when we get to talking about liberation, especially academics, but also in movement circles, when we get to theory, that's when they opt for white folks. It'll be black all along the way, the baddest sisters, the baddest brothers. Then when you get to theory, it's Marx and Engels. It's somebody white. Or they'll go get Althusser or some of these other, or Foucault. Foucault got most of his thesis about prison. You know where he got it from? After he came here and toured from the Black Panther Party, George Jackson and Angela Davis, without giving them credit. There's an excellent piece I cited in the book by Heiner that talks about Foucault's expropriation without attribution. When it gets to theory, that's when they opt out. People don't like Harold Cruz because he said something about Lorraine Hansberry or somebody like that. So they don't want to read Harold Cruz. But these Marxists will teach Althusser. Althusser killed his wife. Literally, he killed his wife. Got away with it too. He said, but they still study Althusser, and they got folks who don't want to study Booker T. Washington because they don't like something he's saying or with respect to Du Bois. Let Du Bois come from enslavement in Alabama and be operating during the period of the Nadir in Alabama. I bet he have a whole different rap than the one he came from with Great Barrington. I ain't mad at either one of them.
Absolutely.
Choose one or the other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Booker T. Washington was 9 years old when slavery ended, and Du Bois was raised amongst the Northern New England liberals, so they had a different worldview. And a book that I had started writing a few years ago, I actually equate Du Bois in many ways to like the biblical Moses, being raised in Pharaoh's house and having to come down among the slaves to see how the slaves lived before he started his march towards Africa. Because what you see over Du Bois' life is this internal struggle between, I guess, that European side and that African side, but he's always pushing towards Africa, trying to reclaim Africa. And I think his final statement that he made in his life was abandoning his American citizenship and claiming citizenship in Ghana. So his whole life was a trajectory that was pointing towards Africa. That's at least the argument that I make in the book that I had started writing, that I need to finish writing myself. Okay, so you had mentioned, you were talking about civilizationism. And this is something that you find in the, because you reference Garvey, because that's definitely one of the tenets, the aims and objectives of the UNIA, where they say, one of the tenets is to civilize the backwards tribes of Africa. But you see that also in the Pan-African Congress. When you look at their aims and objectives, they have the same language that, civilizing the backwards tribes of Africa. Like, they both have that language in their goals as an organization. But you mentioned Malcolm took on the reverse civilization, but I would argue that Du Bois did the same thing. In 1961, he gives a talk on the revolution in Africa, And in this talk, and I can find it for you and send it to you, but he basically says that it's not going to be, the Negro in the West Indies or the Negro in the Americas who's going to be, leading us. It's going to be the folks coming off of the continent, because they are further ahead, in the movement. And he said this will be the future of our movement. The future of the movement will be led by folks from the continent. So I wanted to get your feedback on that.
Sure, I think even earlier in the world in Africa, that's what he's trying to do at Dunbar and Oaks, and laying the basis for the power of the UN and the end of colonialism, so that the Africans can, because they are much closer to statehood and international power through the United Nations, which Du Bois is present at the founding of the UN at Dunbar and Oaks. So yes, I agree with you, but Du Bois also dies a Marxist. He's in Ghana, but he had supported Stalin, and I don't think he ever repudiated that either, even as he learned of the some of the Stalin's atrocities. So Du Bois is an interesting figure. Cruz often said that he never accepted that double consciousness. He thought that was he called it a fraud. I wouldn't go that far, but that's how Professor Cruz thought. So Du Bois does, and I would have no problem with that, and that he agrees with, or he takes some of these reverse civilizationist orientation. But Du Bois is often he's ambivalent throughout much of his life. I mean, now go back to the Talented Tenth. He does say the Talented Tenth, but then he says it's a socialist of the past from 1907. So that Du Bois is a strong advocate for the Negro church, but then he castigates the church. So by the 1930s, he's saying that the three main institutions we need to build on are black colleges, and he's very African-centered, Afrocentric. Du Bois coins the term Afrocentric in 1961, and he's very Afrocentric in his 1933 speech at Fisk. And he says black business, the black church, and black business and the black church and black education.
Yeah, that was the so one thing about Du Bois throughout his life is, he's the one scholar that you will find him on every side of every issue, throughout his life, because
he's got some consistencies too. Like he never goes back on black culture, for example. He solidifies that and he stands firm on that. And he talks about he'll waver on form of, he has nationalistic tendencies, but I wouldn't argue that he's a nationalist, but he contributes to nationalistic to black nationalist thought. His piece on a nation within a nation, his critique of Marxism. It's interesting to hear Du Bois, his critiques of Marxism, and then his advocacy of them later in life. It's a similar thing with Baraka. Baraka has some of the most scathing critiques of Marxism until he becomes a Marxist, So for me, it's to appreciate the fluidity of it. There's a famous quote Wilson Moses often uses. It's from Emerson. He says, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds." We find contradictions, we find them consistently. So the contradictions don't trouble me as much. It's just the opportunities presented by them, as opposed to saying, no, this person was this or that. Why? Again, who trained us to think like that? No, there are many things at once. So I share with students too. I say I'm absolutely opposed to absolutes and dogmatically against dogma. But I'm asymptotically close to your point that he's on. You find him on every point on every issue. So I come very close to it, just not at the extreme.
Gotcha. So I have a couple of questions coming here from the chat. The one first comes from Brother Richard White of Time for an Awakening. He says, by pursuing culture and the Cultural Revolution, could it be said that the revolution is movement towards a stateless society?
Well, this is what James Boggs argued. Boggs argued that blacks encompass the greatest opportunity to move revolutionary struggles to that of a stateless society. I don't know, and I'm a social scientist. But I don't do prediction, and I don't think. I think these are the results of choices and strategies, opportunities, the terrain upon which your forces are presently deployed. There's so many contingencies, so I don't know. And it's one of the things that I challenge is more deterministic views of how this must lead to this, and I think that's taken from this sort of stages approach to history, which Alain Locke, who's the other theorist that I spent a lot of time, I fused Du Bois's thesis with that of Alain Locke. And Alain Locke had a dynamic thesis on cultural revolution that he proposed in 5 lectures at Howard University and the YMCA in DC in 1915 to 1916. Alain Locke of 1925 is still to the left, but he's more, he's not as radical as he was in the teens. And in the teens, he's making the point. For example, he says there's no, well, Boas has showed there's no biological basis for race, and he's argued there was anthropological. Well, Locke had argued by that time that it wasn't an anthropological basis for race either. It was strictly sociological. Instead of races making civilizations, Locke argued, civilizations made race. And he implicated white supremacism in the ongoing World War. So I read Du Bois and Locke, but Locke has a thesis on culture that takes it away from these notions of stages. But it's from Locke that I get this notion that Harold Cruz puts in The Crisis of Negro Intellectual. A cultural revolution is necessary to stimulate political and economic revolution. Better. Cultural revolution may be necessary to stimulate political and economic democracy so that you can move to a position of racial democracy. That was Locke's thesis. That's the closest he got to stages. And he said no state, no country had achieved racial democracy yet. This is what he was writing in 1948 or 43. So Locke, I read Du Bois's thesis on the role of Black culture in political revolution. See, the slave revolution was a cultural revolution in Black America that created the political revolution, which was the actual fighting during the Civil War. The Civil War in the United States, see, was a political revolution. It overthrew the Confederacy. It was an economic revolution. It overthrew slavery as an economic system. But it wasn't a cultural revolution. It maintained white supremacism, the same white supremacism we're enduring now. That's why cultural revolution remains salient. It remains salient because white supremacism remains salient. It's not because I like culture.
Let me ask you a question then, right? So Afrocentricity, right, or Afrocentric theory, Afrocentric thought. Could Afrocentric thought, right, be the thing that is needed to induce that cultural revolution, right? Something that can kind of attack the bulwark of, white supremacism. Like, what are your thoughts on that, and the ways in which Afrocentric thought can be strengthened to achieve that goal of cultural revolution?
Oh, sure. Now, this is what my first book is about. 1995, I published a book called Afrocentrism in World Politics Towards a New Paradigm. This is what I was trying to propose. In world politics, the main thing we study are we do international economics, international trade, but it's mainly war, international war. So I was concerned about that, an Afrocentric theory of world politics. So I would argue that Afrocentrism has done this. There's a reason why. It's not just because we like festivals, that if you look at what comes out of the Black Power movement that's institutionally consistent, much of it is cultural, not just for example, the Shrine of Black Madonna or Kwanzaa. Third World Press. You know what I'm saying? These institutions that are cultural persist, but it's also because a cultural niche is something that we occupy, and we've been excellent at it. But the larger cultural impact has been in education. Let me demystify. African American culture is centered, and this is from V.P. Franklin. Also, I think it's originally from Philly. Three foci of African American culture: freedom. We define freedom in this country, and arguably for the modern world. Our images resonate with freedom. When folks want to legitimate their freedom struggle, they raise our image, they sing our songs, okay? When I say I'm talking about African American, Black American. Okay? This freedom. The other is education. We're the only people here threatened with death to even try to learn to read and write. Yet we do. Not only King talks about this, not only during the time of enslavement and thereafter, but King talks about this in his last Sunday sermon, Remaining Way Through the Great Revolution. How many Black folks, once the opportunities were open, how we were studying vigorously. He said, I didn't see the similar effort among white folks. Freedom, education. And the third one was family. We define family in this country. The best, when I say define, I mean we epitomize the best of it. And this is why you have this consistent attack on black families, and especially attack on black women associated with black families, because we define familyhood. The largest movement of people inside this country before the Great Migration was after the end of slavery, and it was black folks moving throughout the South to find their families. So it's important when we talk about culture. I don't want people thinking I'm talking about basketball or rap record, okay? But Afrocentrism it has contributed though to those understandings. However, I find Afrocentrism much too conceptually becomes too limited. I think we were talking about this before, and I think Afrocentrism. I find Afrocentrists throughout history. And Du Bois's speech in 1933, I don't think of Afrocentrism as an identity. It's simply a worldview, just as Eurocentrism is. These are just worldviews. Now, peoples of different, Asiacentrism, you can have worldviews. The largest amalgamation of people would have a worldview, okay? So I'm being arbitrary, but I'm not being capricious. I'm saying worldviews are the large-scale basic conceptions of the people about nature, self, and society. Okay? Worldviews have three tendencies. They can be universal, that is, you can uncover universal truths. I mean, someone can understand and explain what gravity is, what seasonal change is, what the germ theory is. Okay, you can uncover those things. The buoyancy for floating a boat. Universal. A worldview can be parochial. That is, we're the Henderson people. We know there are other type of people out there. We just saying for us, we gonna have bald heads, okay? We not knocking nobody else in their hair and their beautiful locks, but for us, we are, okay? We're not saying better or worse, just what we do. Parochial, and they can be supremacists. Supremacist one, that's white supremacism. The functional form of racism in the world is white supremacism. And racism is just the belief, policy, and practice of domination based on the specious concept of race. Right? There's no scientific meaning to race. That's what Locke showed back in the 19 teens. However, race has meaning. And also for Locke, he said it's specious, but he said it's still important. And he said black folks shouldn't jettison it. He said it's necessary to have what he calls secondary race consciousness. It's a beautiful discussion. I talk about him in the book. But anyway, so worldviews have these three. It's the supremacists that I attack in Eurocentrism. But white folks, they got a right responsibility to speak their own cultural truth too. They just don't have the right to impose it on nobody else. Yeah? So this Afrocentric literature that I find throughout African-American and African literature, okay? So if we look at Afrocentrism in the broad terms, in that sense, the way Du Bois talks about it in 1961, the way Sheikh Anta Diop is researching in what comes out in 1974, for example, and many others, okay? What I don't subscribe to is what I call vulgar Afrocentrism, which suggests that there's an African way. Let me be for real. I also teach African politics, and I study with Ali Mazrui, among others. He's in grad, and I know something about Africa. Okay, there's some 200 different ethnic groups in Congo alone. Here, Democratic Republic of Congo. So to say something is African is meaningful only if you're talking about something European or something Asian. But once it gets down to something that goes through society, it's important to appreciate the breadth of what these conceptions are. So when I would hear people say things like, well, Africans, we're more curvilinear and European more linear, this is silly, okay? I mean, Democritus, the Greek, is saying all of reality is fire. You know what I'm saying? You can't get more dynamic than that, you know what I'm saying? But what I often find is folks will teach it, will have a vulgar concept, just like with vulgar nationalism. That is, it suggests that there's one conception of it. And I reject that, just like for vulgar Marxists. That's one of the shortcomings of a lot of the Marxism that came from the United States is mostly Euro-Marxism. It wasn't adequately fitted to the United States to start with until Harry Haywood. So Afrocentrism, I want to argue, has done that. But when it gets to revolutionary theorizing, this is unfortunate. When Sheikh Anta Diop talks about the Osirian Revolution in civilizational barbarism, this is the first revolution in human history. What was it for? I don't see Afrocentrists enough, I would argue, building on the revolutionary thesis, even if they went to Egypt. Now, I don't have, I'm not going to stay in Kemet long, because this is the beginnings. And these, just like I talk about Malcolm, but to talk about Malcolm, I go back to the Black nationalists of the 17th century. So I want to show the consistency. But I want to show how it's been built. to deal with modern challenges. Okay, and so what I find and what I critique in my book is that I was talking to too many Afrocentrists who know more about or want to talk more about 21st century Kemet, but didn't know 21st century African politics. Like they don't know the regional opportunities presented by Ethiopia, the DRC, Nigeria, Black ruled South Africa, and Angola. Why that nexus is important. Because they didn't even know who the leaders of the country were, much less the politics that were operating in them. So this was part of the challenge that I had. And in the book I wrote and published in 2015, it's called African Realism. And this is when I engaged that. Oh, brother, I'm not boring you, man. You started yawning, bro. Go ahead.
You're not boring me at all. I've been in conference planning mode, so I haven't been getting much sleep. And
yes, sir.
I'm writing an essay whose deadline for submission is today, and I'm also preparing for a lecture that I have to give on Wednesday. So
let me know if I can be of assistance to you, brother. When we get off this line, let me know if I can be of assistance, brother. Yeah, you're doing good work.
Absolutely. So family, we had about 2:40 right here. This isn't church, so we don't try to keep y'all all day. We don't want to monopolize your time. But we do want to, there have been a few people asking questions in the chat, and I've tried to ask them all. If there's any question that you want to ask that has not been asked, you can unmute your mic and ask yourself. You don't have to write it in the chat. So I'll give 10 seconds here for somebody to unmute and ask a question before we try to close up with our dear brother, Dr. Errol Henderson, right? I said it right that time?
Yes, sir. Like the air you breathe and then roll. Errol.
All right.
Thank you very much, brother.
All right. Any questions from the chat? Come on, this was a dynamic speaker today, y'all. Y'all usually got all the questions in the world.
I'm trying to wait for everybody else because I'm going, as you know, and I've said it to you, brother Omawali, I'm going through the book now. We had the interview, but I'm going, and this brother is taking me through a loop, in the depth and the breadth of the book. So I don't want to, I said I got to go to his class. Yeah.
Oh, that's Brother Richard. Thank you, Brother Richard.
Hotep, may I ask a question, or is anyone in line? Because I can't see the chat.
It's all you. The floor is yours, Brother Tristan.
All right. First off, thank you, Dr. Henderson, for your presentation. Question I want to ask you is just a very brief one. When you say Afrocentric, what do you mean? In the most concise way, how would you define Afrocentric?
Yes, sir. Afrocentrism is a worldview that privileges the history of Africa and African peoples. You can apply that to Eurocentrism, Asiacentrism, any other centrism. It's a worldview. From worldviews, that's the succinct definition. It's important to know that worldviews have within them paradigms. Paradigms are disciplinary specific. So in international relations, the paradigm that I proposed, I called African realism. For example, in psychology, you can have Skinnerian psychology, or you can have Freudian psychology. Those are paradigms. In sociology has different paradigms. Weberian sociology, Marxian sociology, those are paradigms. Paradigms usually come out of worldviews. Worldviews are broad and they're not scientific. What separates the worldview from the paradigm? Paradigms are scientific, or they aim to be scientific or pretend to be. We know there could be pseudoscience as well. And I can go.
Thank you.
Paradigm comes your theory, and your theory, your hypothesis, and hypothesis to probability state.
So I guess to clarify, are you saying so Afrocentric in your view is worldview, and within worldview you can have various paradigms and subsequently theories?
Yes, but all of them center on in privilege. See, I don't use privilege as a pejorative. It privileges. It says this is the history we're going to focus on. So, for example, the Afrocentric history may begin with the unification of Kemet. The Eurocentric history may begin with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. You see, so it's arbitrary, but it's not capricious. Okay? So it just tells us the history that we privilege.
Okay, thank you.
What made Afrocentrism so transformative is because Eurocentrists, white supremacists, Eurocentrists like Hegel, denied that we have a history. And Karinga makes this point really well. You show me people without history, I show you people without humanity. Why would somebody propose we had no history? Because they were teaching that we weren't people. Why? So they could enslave, colonize, murder, rape, and kill us. That's why. So they had to pretend they're killing a thing and not a person. So that's why to make something African-centered is transformative. It's not necessarily revolutionary, but it's transformative because it challenges white supremacist Eurocentrism. What we shouldn't confuse is whether it challenges Eurocentrism in total. All people, and I think Brother Karinga made that point too. He said, what is humanity except a construct for the convenience of conversation? What is humanity except the people who comprise it? That's why it's genocide to destroy a culture. Because to destroy a culture is to destroy an irreplaceable part of humanity. You see? So it's important that our theses are consistent. You see? So an Afrocentric paradigm of world politics, which I proposed in 1995, and it's just it's one of many. That's why I reject notions that there's a single way or a single way to do it. This is silly. I don't know anyone who can be that intelligent to tell you there's one way to do something. You know what I'm saying? Or one way to study a people, or one basis for which we should be, for example, unified. Show me anywhere in the world where 40 million people across millions of square miles are unified about anything. I don't mean that literally. But you can have political unity based on this objective, and you can have political allyship based on this. You don't need unity. What do you need? You need committed cadres with a theory that guides their strategy to build institutions that can overturn other institutions and not only persist on their own energy. See? Committed cadres. So some of this is demystifying revolution. So it's powerful what Temple University did in creating the first PhD granting Afrocentric, Africana Studies Department. And what we did at Wayne State to create an Africana Studies Department. Okay, but it should teach a range of approaches and a range of paradigms. But I would oppose something that's simply Afrocentric in the narrowest sense. But Afrocentrism in the broad sense, sure. This is what Diop is saying. What Africa gives to the world. If Homo erectus, she hadn't left Africa and she brought us fire, we'd all still be there. You know what I'm saying? But the richness of Africa cannot be subsumed under a single paradigm, I would argue. And Afrocentrism as a worldview, its breadth is what should be appreciated. And I think the more we do that, the more we'll get into the broader range of opportunities and choices we have from which to apply to our present condition to transform it. But we should be about transforming it and transforming it in a way that at minimum overturns white supremacism and creates conditions for African-American Black flourishing, which would include human flourishing. I hope that's I'm not making a multicultural argument. That's not what I'm not making that. I argue for breadth in Afro, just like I argue for breadth in Pan-Africanism. What kind of Pan-Africanism are we talking about? Sub-Saharan African Pan-Africanism? The whole continent to include the North? To include the diaspora in the Caribbean and the West, in the West Indies, the Caribbean, to include the US and Europe, to include Asia. I was really struck that 5 different types of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism doesn't fail. Pan-Africanism of liberation succeeded. Pan-Africanism of integration has been set upon. And it's just like Diop said, when Diop proposed that Federated African Union, as Africans suffered, African democracy was destroyed. The Belgians, the US, destroyed the democracy in Congo, assassinated Patrice Lumumba. The Belgians just apologized for it just a few years ago. Isn't that something? But Africa wasn't absent from democracy. Look at the democracy of Kagutla in Botswana. Look at that. Now, I still have problems with sexism, but the democracy of Kagutla and Palaver, these are African types of democracy. This is when I leave Kemet. Kemet's not a democracy. I'm not mad at it. It's bringing civilization to the world. I'm not mad at it. I'm saying I don't stay there. Look at Kagutla. Look at how Botswana has developed its capacity. Look at the practice of Palaver. These are democratic forms, okay, in Africa. That's what I mean by the richness of it. When someone tells you there's an African way, you should question that. There are African ways, a whole bunch of them. And we should avail ourselves of a range of them. That's part of where I'm coming
All right, we have space for one last question, and it looks like Sister Wahida, you have your hand raised, so I'm going to allow you to unmute your mic, ask your question. Is Sister Wahida still here with us? I'm trying to unmute you. It won't allow me to unmute you either. She says that she can't unmute. You want to type your question and I can ask it for you? All right, she's going to type her question. She said yes. All right. All right, family, while she's typing her question, I'm going to put in the chat here the Rbg Centennial Conference. Make sure you go get your tickets today. Rbg Centennial.com. Go and get your tickets today. You do not want to miss this historic event. All right, Sister Wahida's question. She says, what other paradigms or theories do you feel are African-centered that can compete with Marxism and other Afrophobic paradigms and theories?
Well, what I propose in the book is the theory of Black cultural revolution in the United States. It's how the Black cultural revolution created a political revolution, how I think you could do it before. I don't find Marxism Afrophobic. Sheikh Anta Diop was a Marxist. He had a Marxist analysis of African development, but he wasn't only a Marxist. See, this is why I said these are not identities; these are just approaches. So he had a Marxist approach and this is in the piece on the African Federation. Now, I would argue that cultural unity of Black Africa is not Marxist. You see, and it's the same author. So I would say these are not identities. I can write a Marxist piece, that doesn't make me a Marxist. I can write a liberal piece, that doesn't make me a liberal. It's just because the paradigms you can use. So I would challenge that folks don't take them as their identities. One of the things in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers would describe itself as a Black Marxist organization. But General Baker shared with me, he said, a lot of us hadn't studied Marxism, you know what I'm saying? But they wanted something to challenge the capitalists and those exploiters in both in the auto companies and in the United Auto Workers, which they call the United Auto Workers stand for you ain't white, you know what I'm saying? So they drew from what they thought to provide that critique. So what some of us are doing is and some of us have done, is to draw on these theoretical arguments. So I argue that Locke's thesis is a non-Marxist thesis and it's African-centered. So is Du Bois. What I fused together in the Revolution Will Not Be Theorized, that's why it's 500 pages, but also why it's free, is to develop these theories from these different, from Malcolm all the way to Jaramogi, to build on what they thought cultural revolution was. And I would challenge students, it's important to do the same thing. When I say students, I mean students of the liberation of Black people. To build on the same thing. So when we get to the level of theory or strategy, they don't opt out for a Marxist one. And this is what I find is happening with some of the Black Lives Matter approach. Think of this. Harold Cruz has argued that one of the reasons why we're not successful at cultural revolution, this is during the civil rights movement, was because we didn't control media. The 50th anniversary of his book, Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, 67, the 50th anniversary, I'm waiting to send in my paper for whatever conference it's going to be. I imagine it's going to be several of them. There's none. So it's mostly brother James Taylor, who does excellent work on Black nationalism in San Francisco. He put together one. And there I'm talking about the role of, Harold Cruz is talking about the role of media, and I have folks saying, what's the relevance of Harold Cruz today? In the era of social media. You know what I'm saying? But they don't go to Harold Cruz for theorizing on media. They'll go to he got some of his stuff from C. Wright Mills, but they'll go to some Marxist argument, they'll go to Foucault, they'll go to somebody's. No, I said, look here, the people who brought us our liberation, they made strategies, they theorized. So the people that are in this book, they're overwhelmingly, they're not simply overwhelmingly Black because I like Black folks, which I do. They're overwhelmingly Black because they were right. They were right. They won. They allowed us to be here. 4 million in 1860. How are we 40 million now? It's not from the good graces of white people, but to study our theory. So there are many. I would encourage you, if you have a specific question about a specific field. Remember, paradigms, as I see them, are often field specific. So they're liberating ones in sociology. I think there's steps toward toward theory, but anti-racism, I argue that the theory should be oriented toward clear objectives, not simply anti-something. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about building on these theoretical arguments, and a lot of this goes back to these early theorists. I'm writing on what's called the Howard School of International Relations Theory, Howard as in Howard University, but the guy who wrote the book for it is a white guy at UPenn. I like him personally, Bob Vitalis, but the Howard School, one of my critiques of his work, and it's a fraternal critique, is when he says, but they're not theorizing. I'm like, yeah, they are. They're not simply just talking about racism. They're talking about how the world works. It's the challenge bell hooks raised for feminist theory. It said to move from margin to center is to move beyond. They don't mean get over it. They mean to engage this, but to move from victimization to representation to agency. That is, what does a feminist world look like? That's what Harold Cruz told me. Afrocentrism will be as meaningful as Marxism when you can say, what does an Afrocentric world look like? What is an Afrocentric? Not what it's not. We know it's not white supremacist. What does it look like? That's what Harold Cruz would say. But I would argue that in these different fields, and I would hope scholarship is encouraging folks to specialize in developing Afrocentric theory in these different fields, but rigorous theory that you don't just present to Black folks or folks that you're comfortable with, but you take it out there, take it to your opposition, take to those who I mean collegial opposition. I ain't talking about going in front of no white supremacists. No, I mean collegial opposition. You know who they are. You know where they're in your buildings. You know what I'm saying? But and in the departments, and challenge them on their grounds. And that's why when I publish these types of books, they're at university presses. They're not self-published. Dr. Ben had to self-publish. We ain't got that excuse 50 years on. You know what I'm saying? So, but I'm not knocking if that's what you do. I'm saying there's got to be some who are doing this. So you integrate or infiltrate, whatever you would call the main classroom. I teach international relations. I'm in the political science department. I teach international relations. Some people actually say, Errol, why aren't you in the Black Studies department? I say, I teach in the political science department so I can teach Black people. Now, to understand that, you want to understand something about academia. We can talk about that in a different time. But it's 300 people in the classroom, many of them white. But I also teach courses on Africa and Africa's international relations. But it's important that we take these paradigms, because the paradigms give you theory, and you get your strategy from your theory. If you don't, all you got is program. This is what's going to undermine Garvey. He's got a program. They don't give him time to develop his program because they're already attacking him. You see what I'm saying? The program is so strong, the potential of the program is so strong, look at how many groups spin off from it. You know what I'm saying? But if he had the opportunity to, and that's why to go back to Garvey, and I was a card-carrying member of Division 407 in Detroit, to go back to Garvey is to build on the best of his theory, because out of his theory comes his strategy. And if you got a strategy, what we say, put a sports analogy, this is the only one I use. If you had a football game, if your strategy, or a basketball game, it's the strategy you use, the type of defense you use. You know you ain't got nobody as good as Allen Iverson on the other side, and he's on the other side. But Allen Iverson ain't gonna beat a boxing one. You got 4 people on Allen Iverson, you know what I'm saying? So you have a strategy to contest. But you don't have your whole basketball team is not for a boxing one. You learn a range of defenses because only one team got Allen Iverson. But you have a range of defenses. And whatever you do, stop running around telling people, this what gets me well, I won't say that. I was gonna say something about the folks who they got t-shirts that say, I'm a revolutionary, this takes us back to Nat Turner. Malcolm, sure, talks about by any means necessary. You know what Malcolm also said? He said, rock them to sleep. You can play country dumb. That's why it's important to suspend judgment. Be patient with your brothers and sisters, because they may just be rocking somebody to sleep. And let them do that too. Have many strategies. That's why they don't know when you come. If you're coming them at 12, tell them you're going to be there at 6. See? Because the people, how many people you see say that? We was going there to protest at noon. Man, we got there, man. They was waiting on us. Well, you told them it's going to be at noon. Of course they waiting on you. Tell them it's gonna be a 6 in a whole different place. This is how we work the Underground Railroad. It's a beautiful, liberating thing when you see how intelligent and heroic our people were. Not just heroic like Harriet Tubman. She was a strategist. She was a scout. She operated in silence and darkness and stealth, and they never caught her. And she led troops in the Civil War. That's Sister Harriet.
All right, family. I see all the questions are now coming into the chat as we knock on the door of 3 o'clock. I'm sorry that we won't be able to ask them, but I'll allow Dr. Errol to just share with you all where you can find him and stay abreast as to the work that he has going on. So if you want to reach out to him via social media or whatever the best way is to contact Dr. Errol, I'll allow him to do that now, and you can ask your
at Penn State. Remember, the book is free. This book, the other book is on religion and world politics. I co-authored with Zeph Miles. It's free as well online, but you can always find me at Penn State. Until last year, I was the only tenured professor in the political science department's history. So I'm not hard to find, a black man, a bald head in political science department at Penn State. So you can find me. My email is my initials EAH13 at psu.edu. You can just Google my name, Errol A. Henderson, and just drop me an email. And if you didn't get a chance to ask your question here, I'll do my best to answer it if you send it to me. But thank you so much, and thank you for the wonderful work you're doing, Brother Omwali, all those folks who came out and asked questions. Thank you for this beautiful work that you're doing, because I wouldn't have come here except that you're doing this exceptional work, brother. And I mean, seriously, brother, call me if I can assist you with any of those things you're doing. I don't do good convention work, but I've been writing papers, and I'll review some if you want. But I mean that seriously. If I can be of assistance, just...
I definitely got this. This coming Wednesday, I'll be presenting on a topic. It's called the Pan-African Costume Ball and the Climate of Confusion, and I'm examining the 5 historical projects that have been done under the banner of Pan-Africanism to give clarity, because there's a lot of people calling themselves Pan-Africanists, and that might be true, but the Pan-Africanism that they're practicing might fall under a particular umbrella that might not be beneficial for our liberation. So I just
see how you left off the 6 and the 7. So I think I see where you're coming from, bro.
Yeah. So.
Sure. Yes,
all right.
Yes, sir.
All right, family. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Always, we meet every first and third Sunday of the month, AI Philly. If you are interested in becoming a member, you can reach out to us at victory@aiphilly.org to request an application. If you want to donate, our Cash App is I think it's AI_Philly. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that somebody has already put it in the chat. So if you want to give a donation to us, you can do that as well. But I'm going to go ahead and close out. Thank you all for coming. Peace, Hotep. Y'all be safe.